You know that song by Metallica. You know the one where James Hetfield sings, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, life for a life, blood for blood. Well, it's actually not theirs originally. It comes from an old folk song called The Cruel Mother, which goes into way more detail than just those 4 lines. But in this case, the song is actually pretty accurate because we're talking about the mother of all torture devices today, the rack. There have been many forms of racks throughout history, but they all do share some common traits. They are designed to stretch out victims, and sometimes they even go beyond just stretching them out. Depending on what you were charged with, the rack might be used to twist off limbs or even pull them apart. Sometimes the rack was used as a sort of interrogation tool before something worse, like the executioner's axe. And sometimes it was used simply to make an example of someone after they'd already been convicted. The rack has been around since ancient times, showing up in ancient Greece and Rome. In fact, there are records of people being put on the rack as early as 146 BC. In ancient Rome, it was usually reserved for the most hated criminals, slaves or prisoners of war. That doesn't mean that the rich and powerful never got the old razzle, but they usually had enough clout to get off easy or at least die easier. It may come as no surprise that the Roman rack also doubled as a form of punishment for Christians who refused to renounce their faith. One of the first widely known martyrs of Christianity was St. Peter, who was crucified upside down on a similar device. His name even means crucified on the rack in Latin. But the rack didn't stay in Europe. While there are records of its use in China, Japan and India, the Spanish and Portuguese also brought it to the Americas, as well as other places that they colonized. The rack was used in Salem during the witch trials, but it was also used against suspected witches in Europe and England for centuries before that and after. But let's start by taking a look at how exactly these instruments of torture worked. There were several types of racks, but the main ones were the straight rack and the stretching rack. The straight rack was exactly what it sounds like. It was a straight board with armholes and a headrest, and it stretched the victim out like a piece of taffy, either by pulling on ropes attached to their wrists or by having their arms pulled behind their back and secured. Then the victim was either left there to slowly regain feeling in their joints, or they were subjected to further tortures. Sometimes they would be suspended from the rack, making it harder to breathe and increasing pain in the joints and muscles. Or the executioner might step on the victim's joints or pull on their legs while they lay secured to the rack. The stretching rack was used for capital offenses and punishments meant to make an example of the criminal. The condemned would be stripped naked and tied to the stretching frame. Weights were then attached to their ankles, wrists and neck, and then a lever was used to extend each limb individually, usually starting with the legs and working up. A person could be broken on the stretching rack, meaning that they died on the rack, or they could live a long and tortured life after the punishment. While execution by rack wasn't necessarily a slow death, it was an agonizing one. And the duration of a session could vary wildly. For instance, during the Spanish Inquisition, a man named Alonso de Santa Cruz y Gutierrez was kept on the rack for 3 days and 3 nights, only being allowed to rest for a few hours total. He was tortured for his involvement in a secret heretical book club. And although he admitted to reading some forbidden books, he denied writing any of them. He was only given water, wine and bread during his 3-day ordeal, and he had to use a chamber pot for bathroom breaks. After he finally agreed to confess, he was executed by burning. But that wasn't the only time someone spent multiple days on the rack. During the rule of King Henry VIII of England, Queen Catherine Howard spent several hours over 5 separate sessions on the rack. She was accused of adultery and other crimes, which she denied. Eventually, she confessed to all charges and was executed by axe. Sometimes confessions obtained through torture weren't worth much, though. Take the case of Giles Corey, for example. He was an elderly man living in Salem during the witch trials when he was accused of witchcraft. Even though he was not a member of the church, he was summoned to court and accused of meeting the devil in the forest and committing various acts of witchcraft, including afflicting one of his neighbors with a sore throat. Although he pleaded not guilty, he was sentenced to death and taken to the whipping post. When he refused to enter the dock and answer questions, he was placed on the rack. At first, he remained silent, so the court had him put on the rack a second time and told to plead guilty or not guilty. After the second session on the rack, he was able to stand and speak, but instead of entering a plea, he said, "I protest my innocence." He was placed on the rack for a third time and left there until he died. Even still, his body was not released to his family, and his widow had to fight for years to prevent his remains from being dug up and further mutilated. Corey's case isn't the only record we have of someone dying on the rack. Captain Thomas Pound, a British Army captain, was captured by the French and sent to the rack because of his refusal to convert to Catholicism. When the sentence was carried out, his spine snapped and he died immediately. There were even special racks made for children. In Salem, Reverend George Burroughs and his 8 accomplices were hanged after being tortured on special child-sized racks. Other small children were put on miniature racks in order to bend their confessions or extract information from them. While the rack was used against all sorts of people, men and women, the methods used varied depending on gender. For women, vaginal and rectal dilation were also common uses for the rack. For instance, Margaret Clither was executed in England for sheltering priests. She was tortured with vaginal and rectal dilators on the rack before her execution. Another popular form of torture that used the rack as a setup was the cat's paw. The cat's paw was a sort of swinging ball attached to a rope or chain that could swing in wide arcs. Sometimes it was weighted and sometimes it was spiked. Either way, it looked very similar to a large animal's paw, hence the name. The victim would be tied to a chair or to the rack, and then the cat's paw would be dropped on their head, face, or genitals. This kind of torture often resulted in permanent disfigurement, blindness, or even death. One man in Scotland was subjected to 288 lashes from the cat's paw and survived. The only thing that stopped the executioner was the fact that he ran out of room to swing the cat's paw. So when did this horrible invention stop being used? Unfortunately, the rack has not gone out of style. It's still being used today in Iran, Syria, and North Korea, among other countries. Torture is still legal in 148 countries worldwide, according to Amnesty International. And several of the methods described here, such as beating, suspension, and stress positions, are considered acceptable forms of torture in those countries. In the United States, torture is illegal, but there are still lingering effects. Victims of torture often suffer from chronic pain, anxiety, PTSD, insomnia, and depression. There are also cases of police brutality and torture in the U.S. every year, even though torture is outlawed. Thankfully, we don't use the rack anymore. Oh, wait, never mind. We still do. Several states in the U.S., including New York and Colorado, still allow law enforcement officers to use mechanical restraints such as the rack in certain circumstances. They are required to document the use of the rack and get approval from a supervisor, though. So if you get arrested in Colorado for stealing a pack of gum, maybe ask nicely. Now check out most painful ways to die or click this other video instead. Hello there, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be looking at the main differences between the Medieval Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition. So if that sounds like a topic that interests you, then please remember to subscribe so that you can get notified every time I upload a new video. Also remember to give this video a thumbs up, because that tells me that you find these topics interesting and it helps other people find the video as well. Now let's jump straight into it. So when we talk about the Inquisition, we usually mean the Spanish Inquisition. And that is probably because the Spanish Inquisition is the best known and probably the most brutal of all of them. However, the Spanish Inquisition was not the only Inquisition that there was during medieval times. There were actually quite a few different Inquisitions during those centuries, and in fact, there were 3 official church courts for dealing with heresy that operated throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. There was the Papal Inquisition, which was set up by the Pope in 1198. The Archbishop's Court of Paris, which began operating in 1252, and the Spanish Inquisition. which began in 1478. So as you can see, the Spanish Inquisition was the last one to start in this video, though I won't be discussing the French Inquisition. But instead I am going to be focusing on the main differences between the Papal Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition. The first major difference between the two Inquisitions was their purpose. The Papal Inquisition was set up to deal with heresy throughout the entire Christian world, so anywhere where Christianity was the dominant religion. It did not focus on any one area in particular. And its purpose was more to control people's religious views than anything else. On the other hand, the Spanish Inquisition was created to target and eliminate heresy within Spain specifically. It targeted people who had converted to Christianity from Judaism or Islam. This was because Spain had been reconquered from the Moors in 1492, and many of the people who lived there were suspected of still practicing some of their old religious beliefs in secret. This is why the Spanish Inquisition focused on blood purification laws, which aimed to force converts to prove that they had no Jewish or Muslim ancestry. And if they could not do that, then they were considered to be impure Christians. Another difference between the two was the way that they handled here. The Papal Inquisition used penance as a means of dealing with here. If someone was found guilty of heresy, then they would have to complete a certain number of acts of penance before they were readmitted back into the church. These acts could include things like saying a certain number of prayers or making pilgrimages to holy sites. But the most common form of penance was doing public works. This could involve things like cleaning church buildings or even helping to build churches. On the other hand, the Spanish Inquisition was much more severe and here was considered to be a capital crime. This meant that people who were found guilty of heresy were often put to death. They were either burned alive or executed in a similar manner to how other criminals were executed. The next difference is related to the previous one and has to do with the punishments that were handed out by each court. As I mentioned before, the Papal Inquisition used penance, which included things like prayer, pilgrimages, and public works. But sometimes it also included punishments that were meant to be humiliating. This was because the goal of the Papal Inquisition was to bring the heretic back into the church. And in order to do that, they needed to publicly humiliate them in order to shame them into confessing their sins and renouncing their beliefs. An example of this was when a heretic was forced to wear a special type of clothing that had a large A painted on it, standing for the Latin word for S, which was used as an insult at the time. Another punishment that was sometimes used was putting the heretic on display in a cage, usually in a public place like a town square. This was again meant to shame them into confessing their beliefs. The Spanish Inquisition did use public humiliation as a punishment sometimes, but it was much less common than with the Papal Inquisition. Instead, the Spanish Inquisition focused on harsher punishments like execution. And when they did use public humiliation, it was usually done in a more subtle way. For example, a heretic might be forced to walk barefoot through the streets while carrying a heavy cross. Or they might be sewn up in a leather sack along with a donkey and paraded through town. Another difference between the two Inquisitions was the way that they gathered evidence. The Papal Inquisition relied heavily on torture to extract confessions from suspects. They used things like racks, thumbscrews, and waterboarding to get people to confess to heresy. Sometimes they would even burn people's feet to get them to confess. The Spanish Inquisition also used torture, but it was not as common as with the Papal Inquisition. Instead, the Spanish Inquisition relied more on witness testimony and on the accused person's own words against them. The next difference is how trials were conducted by both of these courts. With the Papal Inquisition, trials were conducted in secret. This was done to protect the accused person's reputation in case they were found innocent. It was also done to prevent the accused from having the opportunity to influence witnesses or tamper with evidence. The Spanish Inquisition, on the other hand, wanted trials to be public events. This was because they wanted to use the fear of public humiliation and punishment to get people to confess to heresy. It was also a way to make sure that people were aware of what was happening and to prevent them from committing heresy themselves. Finally, another difference between these two Inquisitions is how long they lasted. The Papal Inquisition lasted for around 300 years, from 1198 to 1492. This is when the Spanish Inquisition took over. The Spanish Inquisition lasted for around 350 years, from 1478 to 1834. It ended because the Spanish government was under the rule of Napoleon at the time, and they were forced to abolish the Inquisition. I hope that this video has helped you to understand the main differences between the medieval and Spanish Inquisitions. I know that the subject of the Inquisition can be a bit sensitive, but I try to approach it in a way that is respectful to everyone involved. If you think that I did a good job, then please give this video a thumbs up and remember to subscribe so that you can get notified when I upload a new video. Thanks for watching. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. In my last video, I spoke about the various terms used for Jews who converted to Christianity under duress and how these terms were often used interchangeably with slurs and insults. In this video, I want to look at one of those terms in particular, the term marrano, and explore how it came to be used as an insult. We'll also look at how the Spanish Inquisition dealt with people suspected of being marranos and the origins of another word used to describe them, converso. The Spanish Inquisition was a court established by the Catholic Church to combat heresy and punish those who practiced Judaism or Islam secretly while living in Christian Spain. But before we dive in, let me remind you that there is a difference between a heretic and someone who converted from one religion to another. A heretic is a person who does not adhere to the beliefs of their church. If a Christian commits heresy, they are a heretic. So if a Christian refuses to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, they are considered heretical. However, just because someone converted to Christianity doesn't mean they stopped believing in their previous faith. A person may have converted due to persecution or to protect themselves and their family. But after outwardly converting, they may have continued to practice their original religion in secret. The term marrano comes from the Latin word sus, which means pig. The reason for the use of this animal is rooted in anti-Semitic stereotypes that date back to the Middle Ages. Jews were stereotypically associated with pigs, likely due to dietary restrictions imposed by some Jewish sects prohibiting the consumption of pork. This association caused non-Jews to characterize Jews as unclean and unhygienic because of their supposed close proximity to pigs. The Spanish took this stereotype and used it to accuse conversos of engaging in ritualistic practices involving pigs, which were deemed heretical and blasphemous. Conversos, also known as enusim, refers to Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity. While the term marrano specifically refers to Jews of Iberian origin, the term converso includes Jews who were coerced into converting throughout Europe, Asia and Africa. The word converso itself stems from the Latin word converso, which signifies one who has been turned or transformed. This transformation often pertained to the change of religion from Judaism to Christianity. During the Middle Ages, accusations of heresy against conversos increased. These charges were typically based on rumors and innuendos rather than concrete evidence. People would spread rumors of conversos performing illegal acts like killing Christian children for ritual purposes. There was no truth to these accusations, but they were used to target conversos and incite violence against them. It was common for mobs to attack conversos based on these unfounded rumors, resulting in the deaths of many innocent people. By the 15th century, suspicion towards conversos grew into an obsession with identifying secret Jews in Christian communities. This fear and mistrust led to the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. The main objective of the Holy Office of the Inquisition was to discover and punish those who practiced Judaism, Islam, or other non-Christian religions in secrecy. When the Spanish began their campaign to expel and convert Jews and Muslims within their borders, there were those who chose to convert to Christianity rather than leave. Some of these converts were genuine in their faith and willingly renounced their previous beliefs. However, others converted only outwardly, continuing to practice their original faith in private. These individuals became known as conversos. The Spanish Inquisition viewed conversos with suspicion, believing them to be less than fully Christian due to their Jewish ancestry. Inquisitors believed that blood had more power over a person than water, meaning that one's heritage had a greater influence on their actions than baptism. This belief resulted in conversos facing severe discrimination and mistreatment. Despite outward appearances, the Inquisition saw them as practicing Judaism in secret and subjected them to rigorous scrutiny. Under the Inquisition, conversos faced a range of accusations, the most common being the crime of Judaization. This accusation carried severe penalties, including public penance, imprisonment, exile, or even execution. If found guilty, the punishments were intended to humiliate and deter conversos from practicing Judaism. One method employed by the Inquisition to identify suspected heretical behavior in conversos was the use of the phrase "in su jugo," literally meaning "in their stew." This saying referred to the idea that certain foods commonly eaten by Jews could indicate their secret adherence to Judaism. For example, the use of unleavened bread during Passover or the inclusion of certain ingredients in traditional Jewish dishes could raise suspicions of heresy. By monitoring what people ate, the Inquisition attempted to gather evidence of secret religious practices. This practice reflects the lengths to which the authorities went to uncover alleged heresies among conversos, invading every aspect of their lives to ensure compliance with Christian practices. Another common charge against conversos was the crime of apostasy, which pertained to abandoning Christianity for another faith. Apostasy was seen as a grave offense against the Church and the state, and those accused faced severe punishments. To prove their unwavering commitment to Christianity, conversos were often required to produce documents known as autos de defensa, or proofs of defense. These documents served as testimonies from godparents or members of the Christian community vouching for the individual's Christian upbringing and practices. Without such proof, conversos were vulnerable to accusations of apostasy and the subsequent harsh penalties. The Inquisition developed various tools and methods to extract confessions and testimonies from suspected heretics, including conversos. One such method was the use of torture, which aimed to break down the accused and elicit incriminating statements or confessions. Torture took various forms, including physical pain through devices like the rack or waterboarding, as well as psychological pressure through sleep deprivation or solitary confinement. The threat of torture loomed over conversos, making many confess to charges, whether true or false, to avoid its excruciating application. The Spanish Inquisition primarily targeted conversos and moriscos, the term used for Muslims who converted to Christianity, on the suspicion that they continued to practice their original faith in secret. The suspicion stemmed from anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim prejudices deeply ingrained in Spanish society. As a result, conversos faced significant challenges and persecution throughout Spain. While there were efforts by some individuals and organizations to protect conversos, such as providing legal counsel or sheltering them in safe houses, these acts of aid often went against societal norms and legal authority. Many of these acts were done in secret due to the high risk involved in openly opposing the Inquisition. Here are some examples of how the Inquisition treated conversos. During the early stages of the Inquisition, the focus was primarily on identifying and punishing those who outwardly displayed Jewish or Muslim customs. However, as time progressed, the methods became more aggressive and intrusive. In Toledo, Spain, the authorities implemented measures to control the behavior of conversos. They prohibited conversos from owning Christian slaves, displaying Jewish books, or partaking in certain celebrations like Passover. They were also barred from attending synagogue or having contact with non-Christian clergy. These restrictions aimed to isolate conversos from their cultural and religious practices and ensure their full integration into Christianity. Another instance of persecution occurred in Seville, where conversos were forbidden from eating certain foods associated with Jewish cuisine, such as unleavened bread, fish without fins or scales, or meat from animals not slaughtered according to Jewish rituals. The Inquisition's food regulations extended to prohibiting the use of Jewish measuring units, utensils, and even wine from specific regions. These restrictions demonstrate the extent to which the authorities sought to erase any trace of Jewish customs from public and private life. And in Granada, the Inquisition targeted conversos for alleged ritualistic practices, accusing them of performing magic, witchcraft, and heresy. Suspicions arose from the use of amulets, astrological charts, and healing remedies, all of which were linked to Jewish traditions. Conversos were subjected to house searches, interrogations, and public trials aimed at exposing their alleged heretical activities. These measures taken against conversos reflect a broader pattern of persecution and discrimination aimed at eradicating any perceived remnants of Judaism or Islam in Spain. The Inquisition's tactics aimed to force conversos into complete assimilation and prevent them from maintaining any connection to their ancestral traditions. In conclusion, the Spanish Inquisition played a significant role in shaping the treatment of conversos and Marranos. Established to combat heresy and enforce religious conformity, the Inquisition targeted conversos based on their Jewish ancestry and perceived deviation from Christian practices. Accusations of heresy, apostasy, and ritualistic behavior led to severe penalties, including torture, imprisonment, and exile. The use of terms like Marrano and converso as insults and derogatory labels further marginalized and stigmatized those suspected of secret religious practices. As the Inquisition intensified its scrutiny and control over conversos' lives, they faced immense pressure to conform outwardly while trying to preserve their heritage and faith in secret. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition continues to resonate, reminding us of the dangers of religious extremism, persecution, and the importance of protecting civil rights and religious freedom. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the history of anti-Semitism, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to support my work, you can do so through the links in the description below. Wishing you all the best and see you next time.